Hey everyone, welcome back. We have a special guest with us today. We have Mike Petchenik. He's here with us today, and it's an honor and a pleasure to have him on the podcast. Mike is a national Emmy Award-winning journalist. He has devoted more than 20 years of his life to being a TV news reporter, anchor, and producer. Mike's fascination with true crime came about from his years with the judicial system. And during his career, Mike covered some of the highest profile trials in the Midwest and Southeast. Mike now runs his own media consulting business where he works with a variety of corporate and nonprofit clients to help amplify their stories to the masses. The name of his business is Petchenik Media Group. And we'll mention it again at the end of the podcast so that if you'd like to reach out to him, you can do so. Mike is also an active contributor to Trial Watchers. And with that, Mike, I'd like to welcome you to the show. Thank you for making some time today.
Thanks for having me, Ramon.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So, Mike, I'd like to go ahead and just to get people to get comfortable with, so that they can know who you are. And I'd love to have to, just kind of get to know you a little bit better. Can you tell us, where did you grow up?
Ramon, I grew up in the northern suburbs outside of Chicago in a place called Northbrook, Illinois.
Nice, nice. What's that like?
It's a very quaint, quiet community, great school system. If you're familiar with John Hughes films, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, 16 Candles, he based a lot of his movies on his hometown, which is my hometown of Northbrook. So if you see those movies, a lot of the scenes were shot at my high school and in and around that area. In the movies, though, he would call it Shermerville, which is an ode to the city's first name, which was Shermerville. And there's the street that runs right in front of my high school is called Shermer. So Ferris Bueller is among my favorite movies of all time. So if you go check it out, you'll see my high school prominently displayed.
That's awesome. I've seen that movie a couple of times, but I think I'll have to watch it again. That's cool. That's a cool coincidence. And Mike, so you're a journalist. Can you tell us a little bit about what led you to become a journalist?
Yeah, so back when I was in high school, my freshman year, I joined the speech team. And for the unaccustomed, the way speech teams work is similar to debate in that you are competing against other people week in and week out speaking. And in my case, I was in a particular event called radio speaking, and that entailed taking a bunch of Associated Press news copy and having to condense it down into about a 5-minute long newscast, and then taking a stopwatch and going into a room, and a judge would be on the other side of the wall listening through the microphone, and I would read the newscast as if I were a broadcaster and have to time it out just right. I had to hit between 4:50 and 5:05 or I was disqualified. And so I would do that week in and week out for the entirety of my high school career. Thankfully, I had some success at it. I was the 1997 state champion in Illinois. Not to toot my own horn, but I had some success with that. But because of that success and because of the fact that I was a prolific writer in my English classes, I had a guidance counselor who suggested that journalism would be a good path for me. I thought I might go to law school, maybe business school. She said, why don't you check out journalism programs? So I went down to the University of Missouri School of Journalism, which is the oldest program of its kind in the country and one of the most prestigious, very hard to get into. And they run an NBC News affiliate as a part of the curriculum. And I was immediately hooked. I said, this is the place where I want to be. I want to be making TV, working in television news. And so I applied and got into the program. The first 2 years of the program is basically a liberal arts program, and then you have to really have good grades to get into the broadcast part of the program, which I did for the last 2 years of my career there. And that launched my journalism career.
Nice. And I think we were talking before the podcast, you were telling me that you also took the LSAT, right? And you did pretty well.
I did, yeah. So I thought, if I don't like journalism or for some reason I just, it doesn't work out, I want to have a fallback. So I did take the law school entrance exam. And because the score is good enough to hold on to for 3 years, I kind of hedged my bets, took my first job, which was in Augusta, Georgia. And 22 years later, did not go to law school. But after talking to my friends who are lawyers, kind of glad I didn't go.
Nice, nice. You know, and it's funny, and you probably know this as well, but a lot of people that do go to law school and become attorneys, a lot of them do not become practicing attorneys, right? Some of them become writers or they go into other professions and ultimately don't
Yeah,
practice law.
it's a tough job, you know. It's demanding, especially if you're working, you know, for a big law firm and their billable hours you have to meet. You know, I've got a relative who is a labor and employment attorney. It's a tough world. Criminal defense is very difficult. PI work is difficult. So you have to really be driven to do it, and it's a challenging career.
Nice, nice. And just out of curiosity, I always like to ask this question, Mike, if we had known you back when you were in high school, what were you like? Who were you then?
Yeah. So I think, like most high schoolers, I was timid and maybe sort of figuring out who I was.
Yeah,
And at the time, having joined the speech team, I was also a musician, still am to this day. You know, I kind of found my people and found my niche and kind of eventually came out of my shell. And by the time I was a senior in high school, I had a pretty good idea of who I was and what I was all about. But those first couple of years were pretty awkward.
yeah. Cool, cool, cool. So Mike, you've accomplished quite a bit in your life, you know what I mean? And you know, and I think there's always you know, a unique story behind it. I'd love to know for you, what is it that drives you? What is it that you're chasing and what is it that you're running from?
Yeah, so my parents would tell you that I was always a self-starter. They didn't really have to light too much of a fire under me. For whatever reason, I just have a lot of self-drive, and I'm a self-starter in general. And so I was my own worst enemy, my own worst critic. I held myself to a really high standard, still do to this day. But I think that's a double-edged sword, right? It served me well, and that it forced me to put out the best version of myself every day in whatever it was that I was doing at the time, and continued to do to this day. You know, as far as what I'm running from, I think, as with anybody who's an entrepreneur or anybody who works really in any space, there is an element of self-doubt and imposter syndrome that creeps in every now and then, especially when I left the comfort of a career that I had been in for 2 decades to make some changes in my professional life. I got to a point where I said, gosh, do I really belong here? You know, should people really trust my opinion on something? And I had to keep reminding myself that, yes, you do belong here. Yes, you have the skill set to do these jobs and to work with these clients. And so that's really how I've overcome that. But it still creeps in now and then. As far
Sure,
as what I'm chasing, as cliche as it might sound, I think it's just I'm chasing success, but on my terms. So for me, success isn't necessarily about money. It's about freedom of time and location and the choice to do what I want when I want and for whom, and also to spend time with my family. I have two beautiful children who are teenagers. I'm happily married for 17 years, almost 18 years now. And so
congrats.
spending quality time with my family and enjoying their presence is really what it's all about for me.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And also, Mike, if you don't mind me asking, I know that a lot of times, right, with and that's just life, right? It's like there's ups and there's downs. Could you share with us maybe an experience that you've had, maybe whether it's recently or further back, maybe some bad news or a failure, right, if you will, um, that you were able to turn into something positive, that you were able to, and how you did that, right? I'd love to understand the mindset.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, you know, I had a 20 plus year career in journalism. And back in 2021, I had a midlife career crisis and just burned out, decided that I needed a change in my life. So I hung up my reporter's notebook permanently and took a job at a tech firm as their director of communications. And it was a 180-degree pivot for me because it was a totally new world. It was a startup.
Right.
The skills that I had honed over my journalism career were translatable to this new role, but it was just a very different world. And it was a great experience for me, and I learned a lot, and I met a lot of great people, and really I needed a landing pad after my journalism career. But unfortunately, about 19 months into that role, the role was eliminated and I was laid off, which was ironic because in television news, layoffs are pretty commonplace. It's not uncommon for reporters and anchors and producers to get shifted to new roles or to just be cut out of newsrooms altogether. I managed to avoid that over the 2 decades I was in my career. So I consider
Mhm.
myself lucky that it took almost 22 years for me to face my first layoff. That in and of itself was difficult, but it happened at a particularly difficult time in my family's life with some health issues going on and some other problems we were trying to overcome. And so it was sort of like uh, uh, it all happened at once, right? And it was
Right,
when it rains, it pours, they say. And so
right.
that was a particularly dark time. And then I spent several months trying to find my next job in a corporate setting. Interviewed for, I don't know, half a dozen roles where I made it to like the final round, and then nothing happened. And it was an ego blow. It was deflating. It was humbling. But
Right.
in that period of darkness and introspection, I decided that if I was going to spend as much time finding these jobs and trying to impress people to hire me, I ought
Mhm.
to take that energy and pour it into my own thing and bet on myself. And so that's what I did. So this was about a year ago, May, and I decided after a couple of months of job searching, I'm done with this. There were many signs along the way that just pointed me in the direction of entrepreneurship. And so that's what I did. I just said, you know what? I'm going to bet on myself and pour my energy into starting my own business. And that's what I did. And truthfully, if I had not been laid off, it probably wouldn't have happened or it would have been delayed. And so it was really the kick that I needed to jumpstart my entrepreneurial journey.
Nice, nice. And by the way, forgive me for all the noise. I mentioned to you, we're right on University Avenue. We have an ambulance, heading
No,
down
it's fine. You're
the.
good. I didn't even hear it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you started your own business. Can you tell me a little bit about, right, your journalism business? Can you tell me a little bit about kind of the types of cases that you like to cover with, as an entrepreneur, as an owner of your own business?
Yeah. So candidly, Ramon, the cases I covered were during my time as a full-time journalist.
Oh, okay.
In my current career, I don't cover cases anymore,
Okay.
aside from Trial Watchers, which is our true crime brand, which we can certainly talk about. But if you'd like,
Sure.
if you want me to expand on the journalism
Well,
part of it, is that
let's
easier?
start. Let's start with what you do with your business. I know we talked about it a little bit. I thought it was a little bit broader than what I understood. But yeah,
Yeah.
maybe you could tell us a little bit about what it is specifically that you do with your business.
Sure. So Petchenik Media Group is a full service media consultancy. So I do a wide variety of things, everything from PR and helping companies get earned media, helping them get their story to the masses, so to speak. I do media training where I work with executives and government officials and teach them how to work with journalists and speak their language because I did it for so many years, and how to message properly and make sure that what they're saying to the reporters is what they need to hear to get their story out there. I also work on a variety of video productions. I work for attorneys' offices producing legal content. And in that role, I help them produce what's called mitigation videos. And for the lawyers who are listening or those who understand the judicial system, there are situations where instead of putting up a character witness on the stand, you will provide a video of that character witness to the judge as they impose sentence. And I've worked on a number of cases where we've done documentary style productions where I've sat down and I've interviewed family members of a defendant who's facing a lot of prison time to learn about their story and their life and where things might have gone wrong and why they're redeemable and worthy of a lower sentence. And the statistics are out there, Ramon, that when a judge sees a video such as this, they're more likely to depart downward from the sentencing guidelines than if they just hear from a witness sitting on the stand. And so it's a really powerful way for me to use my journalism background and my storytelling to help somebody who's facing, the full bore of the law and looking at some prison time.
That's fascinating. I didn't know that that would be allowed. That's yeah, that's such a great option because for a number of reasons, right? Obviously, number one, from my perspective, is the fact it's how effective it is, right? You're saying that it's in some cases even more effective than actually having people come in and speak on behalf of the defendant. But in addition to that, it's obviously convenient, right, for the individuals that would love to be able to, maybe say a few words, but maybe they're not available, or they're on that date and time, or they live in another state, or maybe they're out of the country. Um, and but that's awesome. I didn't know that was something that was available. Do you know if that's available nationwide, or is that just in certain states?
It is. I mean, I've done one in the federal system recently, and those are admissible in federal court. In state by state jurisdictions, it depends on what the rules are, and in terms of like what the prosecutors will allow in, because it's technically not evidence or discovery in the case. It's post trial relief, and so it's just a matter of will the judge allow it in what case. There's also a use for it pre-trial, where we'll do a production like this, and the lawyer will use it as negotiation fodder on behalf of their defendant to say, hey, look, this is what you're going to be up against if this were to go to trial. We can, let's negotiate, or give this person maybe some leniency on the front end, as opposed to prosecuting it and giving them prison time. So there are a lot of applications for it. There are also applications for it on the personal injury side as well, where if somebody has been injured or a family member has been killed in a wrongful death situation, these videos can highlight their life, or the life of the person who's been injured badly, sort of day in the life. And those are provided to the insurance company to say, hey, you need to pay out and do the right thing here, because this is what's going to come out at trial if you don't. This is what this person is dealing with. So it's a way of achieving justice for people through the power of storytelling.
No, I love that. I love that. That is awesome. Yeah, we'll definitely be talking after this podcast, because that's fascinating. I didn't know that was even an option, right? And of course, I have a lot of relationships here locally with attorneys that do, personal injury, or attorneys that do criminal cases, right? And think this could be a powerful tool. And what's interesting, and you mentioned that this could be used to, during the mitigation phase, right? In a sentencing phase of a criminal trial. But being able to use that even beforehand was something also that I'd never heard of, something that it would have never dawned on me. So but I could see it being very powerful. That's awesome.
Yeah. Yeah. And thankfully we've had success thus far with the cases we've worked on, where a judge has seen it and has been moved by the video testimony that he or she is seeing, and has given the person a lighter sentence.
Nice. Now, as far as we mentioned trial watchers, right? You're an active contributor to Trial Watchers. What types of cases do you guys usually cover with Trial Watchers?
Sure. So Trial Watchers is a brand for true crime fans, about true crime fans. And what we've done is, through a variety of media, including a book that we just co-wrote and published, we're telling the stories of the true crime fans themselves, and why they're so passionate about this genre. What is it that makes them get out of their bed at 3 o'clock in the morning and drive to the courthouse and wait in line for 3-4 hours just to get in and sit on those cold, hard pews of the courtroom to watch the trials unfold? And so this started, Ramon, with the Alex Murdaugh case, which is the case of a high-profile attorney in the Low Country of South Carolina who was convicted of murdering his wife and son, and eventually of other financial crimes as well. And my co-author, Neil, his wife traveled to the courthouse in the Low Country, South Carolina, to witness it herself. And that was sort of the impetus for this whole project. She was the original trial watcher that we both knew. Neil and I are both journalists. We've covered trials for years and years, but we've never consciously gone and just been a spectator at a criminal trial. And we met people who've done that, who've gone to murder trials, they've gone to federal trials. They just enjoy going and putting the pieces of the puzzle together. In some cases, they've had a trauma in their life that informs their decision to do this. We interviewed sisters whose father was murdered about 30 years ago. The killer was never brought to justice. They knew the person's name, but the police didn't have enough evidence to go after them and arrest and ultimately get a conviction. So the sisters traveled to these trials to get justice for their father. Pretty fascinating stuff.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. As far as in your opinion, right? You've had some experience, right, with the criminal justice system. What do you think is the most common misconception that people have about our criminal justice system?
I think people have a misconception that the wheels of justice move swiftly because of TV, right? They watch Law and Order, they watch a trial, maybe the story of a trial on the news, and just assume that it was quick. And in my experience, having covered trials, these can drag on for years and years and years. There might be one hearing, you know, 1 year, and then it may get postponed for a variety of reasons. And then what happens is these defendants, in a lot of cases, languish in jail awaiting trial for a long time because of the backlog in many cases. COVID didn't help, right? There's jurisdictions where there are just thousands upon thousands of cases that have been waiting to go to trial for years. And because of that pause over the 2020 period, people are still waiting for their justice. So I think that's a common misconception, that things move quickly, because the wheels of justice sometimes grind to a halt.
They do. They absolutely do. Do you have any experience covering post-conviction proceedings?
So yeah, I've covered some Supreme Court hearings here in the state of Georgia in which defendants were seeking relief. And in a couple of cases, the Supreme Court overturned convictions on technicalities, whether it was an evidentiary mishap during the trial or something else. And so I have seen that, where defendants have gotten new trials because of a decision that the trial court made that the defense attorneys appealed all the way to the state Supreme Court and were able to get that relief.
Cool, cool, cool. And you've made a lot of interesting comments that I definitely want to dive into a little bit more, but I think we're going to be covering some of those here in a moment once we get into some of the examples. Like, for example, on the technicalities, I'd love to be able to talk to you a little bit about some of those technicalities and what your opinion is on those, whether or not they should be overturned. But also on the so I was asking about the post-conviction, right? The last question I asked was because I think you're right. I think people have a misconception of how quickly the system moves, and some people do know that the system moves slow, right? The system moves very slowly, but post-conviction, it's significantly worse. Post-conviction,
Yeah.
And I'm guessing that's got to be across the board, but I know that definitely my understanding of the criminal justice system in Utah, and then I've read hundreds of cases from other states. It can it's like what you said, it comes to a screeching halt. I mean, even if the person has evidence of innocence, right? Even if the person says, we have DNA, I didn't commit, right? You have the murder weapon, whether it's a rock or a gun or whatever it is, a knife, and they say, we have evidence right here, DNA evidence that I'm innocent. And even then, it'll either move incredibly slow, or it'll just completely just stall out for a year or two.
A case that comes to mind for me, Ramon, and I didn't cover it specifically, but I recently heard the defendant speaking to a group of lawyers here outside of Atlanta because it was a Georgia-based case. He was a minor league baseball player back in the mid 80s who was accused and eventually convicted of raping and murdering an elderly woman. He was an African-American man. And what happened in that case is sad. The district attorney and the police in this specific town decided to essentially round up every black man they could find and bring them into the police department for interviews.
Sure.
At the time of the murder, he was on the mound pitching for this minor league baseball team. Yet the police pinned the case on him. He was ultimately convicted and spent, I want to say, 30 plus years in prison, all the while trying to mount his own case for appeal. He boned up on the law. He spent a lot of time in the law library. He filed his own motion for habeas corpus. He went to hearing after hearing after hearing. And ultimately, what got him exonerated was evidence that the person who was in charge of collecting DNA for this particular police department or this crime lab had been planting DNA evidence and had been basically breaking the law. And he was ultimately charged and convicted for doing this. And there were dozens of cases on which he had done this, including this gentleman's. But it just goes to show you that this guy, got out of prison and has now started a career speaking about his life and his situation. But it really does shine a light on the miscarriages of justice that can and do happen.
Yeah, I agree. I agree completely. You know what's interesting is the innocence projects that are out there, they have statistics on how many people they've been able to exonerate. But what most people don't realize is I guess for the average person that might feel like a happy ending to some degree, right? Watching somebody, finally get their life back. And that in itself is a can of worms, right? Like, because that person is damaged. The trauma and the loss can never be we can never make it up to them, right? It doesn't matter how many millions you give them. They've lost, in this case, right, 30 years of his life. He was at the prime of his life, potentially could have, played professional sports. Forget the money, but think about the life he would have had, right? It was just been an absolutely amazing life.
Yeah.
But the point that I guess that I'm driving towards is the fact that these people that have been exonerated, right? I think it's in the hundreds. And not hundreds of thousands, but hundreds. But think of all the other ones, the thousands and thousands that do not get exonerated, that are innocent. And that's something that you never hear. I've never heard people really talk about, right, in mainstream media, because it is incredibly difficult to get a case overturned, even if you have evidence of innocence. And it depends, right? If the evidence is very strong, that just still doesn't guarantee you're getting out. If the evidence is, because sometimes it's hard to prove your innocence 100%, right? It depends on there's the different types of cases, right? If it's a rape case, for example, if somebody's being blamed and accused of that, how do you prove 100% innocence? That's tough. It can be done, I'm sure. You can think of a scenario that where you can do it, but it's incredibly difficult. So even if you have evidence that tends to favor the defendant, right, it tends to support his innocence, but if it's not 100%, he's innocent, the likelihood that they will become one of those few privileged hundreds that get out is so minuscule. So
I mean, look what's happening in the Scott Peterson case right now in your home state of California, right? So he's been in prison for 20 plus years, and now they're trying to get a single piece of DNA evidence extracted from a piece of duct tape in the hopes that it will pin Laci Peterson's murder on somebody else. I mean, just talk about the long shot that they're trying to achieve, the Hail Mary they're trying to throw. And of course, his case is getting attention because of the media coverage that his case garnered. But for every Scott Peterson, there are hundreds of others who are nameless and faceless and just a name on a docket that nobody knows about.
Yeah. And by the way, sometimes, and I'd love to get your opinion on this, but sometimes, and I would argue that most of the time, for most crimes, if a defendant cannot win on a quote unquote technicality, right, and we'll get to that here in a moment, but if they can't win on a technicality where their constitutional rights were violated, then what really all they have left in a lot of cases is just a Hail Mary. Because just as an example, right, misidentification, right? Somebody identifies you, Mike, as the guy that did it, right? That the guy that set fire to that building. How do you prove it wasn't you? If you don't have an alibi, if you don't have camera footage, right? If you don't have unequivocal evidence, right, that it was not you, I mean, something that's undisputable, all you're left with is Hail Marys. Because although the burden of proof before trial is supposed to be beyond a reasonable doubt, and let's put that aside for a moment, but after trial, then it shifts. The burden now is on the defendant, and it's incredibly difficult to be able to overcome that burden of proof, to overturn a wrongful conviction. But I'd love to get your opinion on that.
Yeah, I mean, look, judges don't want to ever admit that they were in error in any way. The trial judges don't want to, fall on the sword and say, yeah, maybe I shouldn't have allowed that piece of evidence in, or I shouldn't have let that piece of testimony not be stricken from the record. right? So there's probably an element of ego there that prevents some of these cases from moving ahead. So, and then once you get past that, again, it's just sort of overcoming that hurdle of convincing then a panel of 3 judges or 4 judges all the way up to the Supreme Court, wherever it is you live. And then it becomes even more difficult to do that. And then, it really is, it's like spitting in the wind. You don't know where it's going to land.
Right. And I'm sure it's the same in Georgia, right? Generally speaking, to get to the Utah or the Georgia Supreme Court, right, to get to the highest court in the state at the state level, once you get to that point, I mean, there's thousands and thousands of petitions that are submitted to those courts. And in Georgia, being a state with a bigger population than Utah, my guess is it's in the tens of thousands of petitions that are submitted to them. But they don't have to review these petitions. In fact, you have to petition to get the privilege of them looking at your case.
Right.
And it's probably just like Utah, it's probably like less than 1% of cases actually earn the right to be able to have the highest court in that state review their evidence of innocence or their alleged errors of impropriety, right? That include constitutional violations and that kind of thing.
Right.
And even that doesn't guarantee you a win. That just guarantees you that they'll look at it, right? So the odds are insurmountable. Once you're convicted, the odds are almost insurmountable, right? To get them overturned.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Another thing that's interesting with the Innocence Projects, and I don't know if you've come across any information on this, but there's a shift that's taken place. I know, and it may not be with all of them, right? Because every state's got at least one of these, or most states, I should say, right? Because I don't know if every single state has one. But the shift that I've noticed here in Utah, and I've heard that there's a number of states that, where they're shifting in that direction. They're really, they're not taking any case unless you have that type of just bulletproof evidence, right? So, for example, let's say somebody breaks into your house, you shoot them, you allege self-defense, and but for one reason or another, right, you end up getting convicted. Because it's a self-defense case, they won't even look at it. Like the Innocence Project here in the state of Utah will not even look at it. They immediately, in fact, in their letter, they'll tell you, these are the types of cases we will not touch. And this is the only thing we will touch. And it's got to be it's got to be the DNA evidence or just some bulletproof evidence. It's almost like they're just going after the low-hanging fruit.
That's what I was going to say. Yeah, they want to take on cases that they know they can win, and they don't want to take on cases where they won't, so that their numbers are going to show that they're being successful. They're sort of stacking it in their favor.
Right. Yeah. So that's interesting. Is that the same? Is that what you've noticed in Georgia, or have you come across any articles about that?
Be honest with you, I haven't, but it doesn't surprise me based on what you've described and based on what I just know in general about the judicial system.
Sure. I'd love to be able to ask you, what is your experience? What are your thoughts on inequality for men and women within the criminal justice system? Is there, what have you observed in your career with regard to that?
Yeah, I mean, just look at a modern day example, even just recently, of the Karen Reed trial up there in Massachusetts. She's the woman who was accused of running over her police officer boyfriend. And then, of course, she said it was Boston police officers who beat him up and then tried to frame her for it. And it was this big to do. And just the other day, there was a mistrial. And so she's going to face another trial now. But I think there's a double standard in play there, right? She's a good looking white female defendant, middle class, has a following, has people that have been throwing money at her case and her cause. You don't necessarily see that all the time. And of course, she became a media darling because of that, right? She sat down and done some network TV interviews and things like that. So I think there's an inequality in as much as, here's a woman getting attention that maybe a man in that position wouldn't. Now, I will couch that by saying, on the other side of the equation, you have a case recently of a man who murdered 2 women down in Florida, a guy named Wade Wilson. You may have seen his face. He's got tattoos all over his face. Objectively a good looking guy, right? He's in his 6'5", built like a tank. And women have been objectifying him on social media, even though he heinously murdered 2 innocent women. And you got to think that that kind of attention and the way people are treating this killer has to have some effect on the judicial system at some point. It's not, nothing is happening in a vacuum, right? So I think that when you have these kind of double standards at play, it's probably harder than ever to get a fair trial or to really get to the heart of a case without there being extraneous factors getting in the way.
Right. So with Karen, you said that's her name, right? Karen? Yeah,
Karen Reed.
So with her, you said there's money being thrown in her direction, that she's getting interviews, right, by some of the media outlets. Is the same happening also with Wade Wilson?
Not to that degree. I mean, he's done some media interviews, and as far as I know, nobody was bankrolling his defense, and he did ultimately get the death penalty. So, you know, he is going to face the ultimate punishment for his crimes, and he was convicted of them. But I just think that there is a standard to play there where people are putting this man on a pedestal because of how he looks,
right,
versus, you know, the content of his character and the fact that he's a convicted cold-blooded murderer.
Sure, sure. Do you know if there's a disparity as far as sentencing? Have you noticed anything like that with regard to with men and women for the same crime? Is there a disparity there in sentencing?
Truthfully, Ramon, I don't have any statistics that I can cite to back that up.
Okay, fair enough. I'd also like to ask you, so we were talking about wrongful convictions. In your opinion, and I know it's a tough question, but just I'd love to know, in your opinion, what do you think is the percentage of individuals, or do you have any idea at all, inkling as to what percentage of individuals that are incarcerated, are potentially innocent, right? There's studies that are done all the time. I don't know if you've come across anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, we do see it all the time. I would be hesitant to put a specific percentage on it, but I know that it can and does happen to the average person. And sadly, it's to those who are in a lower sorry, can I take that part back?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Right, we'll pick up the edit there. So,
sure.
So Ramon, I would hesitate to put a percentage on the number of people who are wrongfully convicted. We know it happens. We see it anecdotally. And unfortunately, it happens in a lot of cases to people of a lower socioeconomic class and to people of color. And so that is why I think it's really great that organizations such as the Innocence Project, as selective as they are still around to provide that relief to people who truly deserve it. You know, the case that I referenced of the young baseball player, the African-American baseball player, is a prime example of that. Now, he was not represented by the Innocence Project, but ultimately was represented by attorneys who believed in him and believed in his innocence, and who picked up the case and helped him get it across the finish line. And that's a prime example of somebody wrongfully convicted merely because of the color of their skin and meeting a description that somebody had in their mind, and then having a nefarious person come in and doctor the evidence to ultimately pin it on them. I imagine those kinds of situations are the exception and not the rule. But from where I'm sitting, and I hope you would agree, that any exception like that shouldn't be tolerated. And as a society, we should be holding our judicial system to a higher level so that it doesn't happen.
Sure. No, I agree with that. The one thing that I would push back on a little bit, and I said a little bit, but I definitely, it's something that I talk about, right, in my social media content, is that I think the criminal justice system, I mean, just to make it easy in a nutshell, is the way that it's set up is unfair for everyone. There's some serious issues, like with the way that it's set up. I mean, somebody who's charged already, for in a lot of respects, they're not innocent until proven guilty, right? The moment that they're incarcerated, they start losing their homes, their family, their reputation, cars, everything. You know what I mean? Well, that's not. They're being punished already.
Right.
And if they can't make bail, then they're being punished for, like we were just talking about earlier, right? They could be punished for a year, 2 years, 3 years until the case goes to trial. So, and I think that's the case for everyone. I don't think that's just for minorities, for people that are African American or of any other ethnicity. I think that's something that I push hard on in my content, because I think that everyone's got to care about us having a fair criminal justice system. Here in Utah, because it's predominantly white, I met personally a lot of individuals that were white that completely got railroaded by the system. And it wasn't just a handful of them, it was a lot of them. And it's unfortunate. And it's something that, yeah, I feel very strongly about. I think I think there's a lot of innocent white guys, right? Like if we wanted to just pick race, that are sitting there in prison, they're innocent, and some of them will never get out. Some of them are going to spend the rest of their life in prison and they're innocent, or they will spend decades or years, and they're 100% innocent. So I always like to be an advocate of just, in general, a fair system for everyone. So.
Yeah, I agree with you wholeheartedly on that. I think that it is punitive from the get-go, because the minute you're arrested, the minute you're put in jail, you're losing your livelihood. Your mugshot might end up on the 6 o'clock news, and you have to live with that for the rest of your life. And even if you didn't do anything wrong.
Right. Yeah. And there's examples of that all the time, right? And all it takes, and that's a perfect transition, right? In the climate that we're living in today, it would be very easy for somebody like, you know, a law-abiding citizen like yourself, right, for that to happen, in the sense that all it takes is just the accusation, right? The power of the accusation, and all of a sudden your whole world gets turned upside down. I'd love to ask you, what is your take on what the Me Too movement has done for the criminal justice system, and what you've seen, and your take on that?
I mean, I think certainly the movement itself, of course, was spurred along by the investigation into Harvey Weinstein and what was happening in his sphere of influence, and I think it has led to convictions of people who, like him, have been mistreating women. Other people like Bill Cosby as well. But I do feel like it can be a double-edged sword, in that prosecutors may overzealously go after someone based on false accusations because they want to fulfill the mandate of Me Too. So I think it's incumbent on prosecutors and police before them to really follow the evidence and try as best they can to investigate in a vacuum, without letting the forces of Me Too color their decisions unfairly and unnecessarily.
Do you feel like that movement has led to wrongful convictions?
I mean, it's very possible. I can't speak of any that I'm aware of, but because of just how widespread the movement has become over the last several years, it would not surprise me if that happened.
Sure. One question to go back to something we were talking about earlier. We were talking about, you know, cases that get overturned on technicalities, right, for our viewers, right, that maybe are not as familiar with the criminal justice system, or the legal system, the Constitution. Who knows, right? We have listeners with varying degrees of various levels of education, right? So a lot of times with these technicalities, there are violations of, you know, somebody's Fourth Amendment or their Fifth Amendment, you know, Fifth Amendment rights, and there's a number of them, including your right to remain silent, Fourth Amendment, which includes a number of things, but your right to be protected against illegal search and seizure. And then, of course, we have your 14th Amendment right to due process, which is also included in some of the other constitutional rights. And due process meaning that things are done properly, that you have a fair proceeding, right, from beginning to end, from the time that you're alleged to have done something, right, the allegation comes out, to the time that you're ultimately convicted and all that. But I'd love to get your take on this. What do you agree with individuals being able to get their convictions overturned based on a constitutional violation?
I do, because if we have rights in this country and they're violated, and we don't have recourse when they are violated, what good are those rights? So I tend to believe that if during the course of a trial one of those rights was violated in any way, you should have recourse, and if it means getting your case overturned, then that's the way the chips fall.
Right, right. Well, let's jump to the next question. I'd love to get your take on, Mike. What do you think? Are there, from your experience, right? You covered a lot of cases, and you've been in this arena for a while. What types of improvements do you think could be implemented, right, to bring about kind of a system that's a little bit more fair, that in the sense for everyone, what I mean by that is, to keep having innocent people being convicted or overly charged, right? Because that's also an issue, and we've not touched on that. But people that are guilty of something that maybe it's a misdemeanor or a very low level felony, but end up getting convicted of multiple high level felonies, end up spending way more time than is necessary for the crime they actually committed. But what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think really the answer in general is checks and balances. So whether it's accountability over prosecutors to make sure they're doing their jobs correctly and not abusing their power, whether it's holding judges accountable. Here in Georgia, we have something called the JQC, which oversees judges. And if a judge makes a decision or abuses their power in any way, there's recourse for lawyers to file complaints through them, and then they're investigated, and the judge can be, up to and including removed from the bench if that happens. I think there needs to be accountability of police officers. Are they doing their jobs correctly and accurately? Are they abusing their power? And I think the beauty of living in the United States is that with free press, with citizen journalists, with a lot of eyeballs, it's harder for any of these entities to get away with malfeasance when there are a lot of people watching them. And, unlike in third world countries or in Russia or North Korea, where there is no accountability and there are no checks and balances, we at least have that here. Now, is it a foolproof system? Absolutely not. And we've talked about several instances where it isn't. But I tend to be an optimistic person in general, and I feel like as long as we're holding people accountable and keeping track of what they're doing, we're at least moving in the direction of being more fair every day.
Sure, sure. I'd like to ask you about, you said that, in Georgia, you guys have a mechanism right in place to hold judges accountable. Have you ever seen a judge be held accountable yourself, like through this mechanism? Have you read about it or heard about it?
Well, there's a case currently underway in Fulton County, Georgia, which is where I am, which is in the city of Atlanta, involving a rapper named Young Thug, who has seen some degree of success in his career. He is accused of being the head of a racketeering and corrupt influences organization, essentially a gang that committed murders and robberies and a bunch of other horrible acts. And he has been on trial. And in that case, the judge held a meeting in his chambers, a secret meeting with prosecutor and a witness, no defense attorneys present, where the transcript shows, basically told him that if he didn't testify, he would go to jail and be held in contempt of court. And it was a long, drawn out meeting. And the defense attorneys caught wind of it and raised the issue in court. Why did you have this meeting without us present? That should be table stakes. We should be allowed in these meetings. And instead of admitting fault in any way, the judge doubled down and held the defense attorney in contempt of court and sentenced him to jail time. And it became front page news, and it was all over the network news as well. And he filed, and on several lawyers on his behalf filed complaints, and essentially got his contempt conviction stayed. And they petitioned the Georgia Supreme Court to look at the case and to examine this judge's behavior. And as of this podcast recording, that case has been put on hold pending an outside judge deciding whether the judge who's presiding over this case should be allowed to continue. Is there a conflict of interest? Has he violated people's rights? And so that's a prime example, I think, recently of a judge being held accountable, of the system doing what it's supposed to do, of the media reporting on the situation and shining a light on it. Now, granted, he's a pop star, a rapper, people know who he is. That certainly didn't hurt his chances. But I would submit that if this happened even in another case and the media caught wind of it, it probably would have gotten some coverage and some traction. And I think maybe the same outcome would have happened.
Yeah, and that's interesting. The big word there, right, is if the media had gotten right, and even I would say even if they had that, you know, I'm a little more of a I'm an optimist in general, but when it comes to the criminal justice system, you know what I mean? I think I'm a little bit of a pessimist because of what I've seen myself, right? And I would argue that, you know, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this, but he's not been held accountable. Being held accountable is that the ruling actually comes out and he's held accountable, not just because the conflict of interest is one thing, right? That's simply it's a decision about whether or not he can continue presiding over the case, but that's not being held necessarily accountable. Being held
Right.
accountable is you did something improper and you're either going to be you know, let go as a judge, suspended, whatever it is, whatever, you know, all the consequences are, including, right, and not limited to potentially criminal or civil penalties. But in this case, it's just underway, right? So he hasn't quite been held accountable.
No, but if I'm reading the tea leaves, I feel like he probably will be, because I feel like based on everything that I've read and have talked to friends of mine who are lawyers who are connected to this inner circle, that
Sure.
what happened should not have happened on a number of fronts, and that he probably will face the music. And then don't forget, he's an elected official too, Ramon. So he will have to face re-election at some point, and voters, you know, sometimes they don't forget things like this.
Yes, yes, I agree, and I hope you're right. I'm gonna hold my breath and hope that you're right, that he actually is held accountable. So, and that the, you know, that this, you know, the local community that will remember that when election time comes again. As far as police officers, I know we touched on that a little bit, and I definitely agree with you that, you know, I mean, we've talked about this before, where the vast majority of police officers are quality individuals.
Yeah.
You know, they're quality individuals. I think where we may or may not disagree, or maybe we just, you know, just a slight variation on that was where you thought that they do a pretty good job of weeding out the ones that are not good quality individuals, right? And if you look at, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this, right? But just to kind of narrow the conversation down a little bit, because I think we both agree on the fact that most police officers are quality individuals that deserve respect. And we absolutely need them in society, right? You know, it all falls apart if you don't have quality police officers. But as far as you know, some of these cases, right, where there's been exonerations, just to use kind of narrow the conversation down.
Yep.
Have you noticed that a lot of times it's the police officers that are right? In fact, the example that we talked about it just a little bit earlier was a police officer planting evidence, right, or a detective, right, within the police department planting evidence. But it seems like with these cases where there's been exonerations, that, you know, individuals that have spent a decade or more, right, incarcerated. A lot of those, it turns out that it was police officers, and those are the ones that got caught, right? Like we were talking about. Those are the people that actually it came to light, not the ones that didn't come to light. But could you expound on that a little bit, kind of what your position is?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in those cases, yes, that the officers were to blame. I don't know if you saw the great documentary series "Making a Murderer" when it came out on Netflix, but the entire premise of that case was that there was a gentleman who was wrongfully convicted of one crime, sued the police department when he got out of prison, and then they had an axe to grind with him, and then planted evidence allegedly to pin another crime on him. Like, that's just an example of like bad policing gone too far, if there's such a thing. And yes, I mean, sure, it happens. It absolutely happens. You have officers who probably, well, not probably, should not be on the force, shouldn't be in positions of power. You've heard the phrase "absolute power corrupts absolutely." And when their powers go unchecked and unfettered, and they're able to do whatever they want, then stuff like this can and does happen. I still would argue that it is very much the exception and not the rule, in general.
Yeah, yeah. And thanks to individuals like yourself, right, and what you guys are doing with trend watchers and you know, all the work that you've done, it ensures that stays an exception, right? Because you guys are doing your job out there watching these cases, bringing, shedding light on things that improprieties, right? Things that should not happen, um, of that nature. By the way, have you guys covered that type of situation, or like situations, cases where maybe there was, these bad apples, right? That went out of their way to.
Not through trial watchers, but when I was a full-time TV reporter, I did cover stories where people were wrongfully convicted or accused of things that they didn't do, and then it came out later that the police maybe didn't overtly plant evidence or something, but it was just shoddy police work where they didn't do their due diligence, they didn't ask the right questions, they didn't test for something, and so there wasn't enough evidence, and then the jury of their peers couldn't make an informed decision, and so they just decided to convict without actually having the full picture in front of them. So I've seen that happen too, and that's equally as dangerous, right? I mean, you expect police officers to do their due diligence and to do their investigation, because they're the first line. They're the people that are collecting the evidence that eventually a jury will see. And so the rules of evidence are very clear, and they have to do certain things with chain of custody. And if they're not following those rules, then the cases are compromised. So I have seen that happen.
Awesome, awesome. Well, Mike, I don't want to take up your entire afternoon, so I'd like to ask you just a few final questions, if I may. I'd love to ask you, what big transition, right, from where we were just at a moment ago, but I'd love to ask you just personally, what do you do every day that makes you happy?
Yeah, so I mentioned that I played in the band in high school. I've been playing the drums for 40 plus years now. I play in a blues band here in Atlanta.
Wow.
And so that's been my biggest outlet, is to just come down to my music room here behind me, just go to the woodshed, rock out to some blues or rock or death metal or whatever I'm listening to at the moment, and just play. And then when I'm with my band, we play out at various venues across the metro area, and it's just fun. If I didn't have to make a living and earn a dollar, I would be living on a bus, riding around playing music. But it's a hobby now. So
That's awesome. That's cool. And given the trajectory, your career recently changed. You have your own business now. Where do you see yourself with your business in 10 years?
hopefully still running that business and growing it, and maybe scaling it to a point where I can maybe take a step back and let other people do what I'm doing. I think if the past year has taught me anything at all, it's that, I love to be able to control my own destiny and not rely on others to make decisions for me. And I think that I want to continue to be able to do that and to provide for my family, but also have that flexibility to do what I want when I need to do it, rather than just pulling a paycheck for the sake of pulling a paycheck.
Cool.
Yeah.
Awesome. I love it. And Mike, if I could ask you one final question, if today was your last day, what three things would you like people to remember you by, to know that what you stood for and what you believed in?
Yeah. So I would say, number one, I'm very passionate. I love my family. I love my friends. I love my work. I pour myself into it every day. I'm very principled. So I believe very strongly in right and wrong. I believe in seeing the good guy prevail, the bad guy go to prison when it's warranted, right? When they've actually done the crime. And I think I'm creative. Throughout my entire adult life and even before then, if I wasn't creating, I wasn't happy. And whether that's music or writing or video production or whatever, putting a puzzle together, I'm bored if I'm not doing it. So passionate, principled, and creative, I think, are the three things that describe it.
Nice. I love it. And Mike, if people wanted to get a hold of you, how can they get a hold of you? How can they find you?
Yeah, a couple of ways. So I have a website. It's www.mikepetchenik.com. And I don't know if you have a graphic there, but it's MikePetchenik, MikePetchenik.com. And that's got all my email addresses, my phone number, and all the things we do with their business. And then for the Trial Watchers brand, you can go to www.trialwatchers.com. And there people can buy the book. They can learn about other content that we're going to be providing as well.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you so much, Mike. It's been a pleasure, and we will definitely be in touch, because I love the work you do, and I think that there's a number of individuals, attorneys, right, law firms around here that I think could definitely use your services.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. All right. I'll see you, Mike.
All right. Take care.
It's